Greetings. I've spoken in the previous mini lecture about nations and about states, and it's time that we put the two concepts together with the concept of a nation state. This is where the nation and the state coincide. Examples would include Japan, Italy, France, Germany, you can go on and on. Usually, as I pointed out in the last mini lecture, calls for statehood begin because a nation demands it, right? Japan, Italy, France, all of these countries, there were a group of people who felt that common identity, a nation, that wanted statehood. For example, there was a nation that we would call the Germans, although they called themselves different things, including Prussians and Austrians, and you can go on with the list. But they were Germanic peoples, and eventually a state came out of that. Now, there are some examples of the opposite, and it is a much smaller list, but I have it listed as the state nation. The state nation is where the state is formed first, and the state generates and shapes a nation through uniform standards, which could be culture, could be art, could be law, could be language. And certainly our country, the United States, is a good example of this. Why we created a new national government, and at the end of the Revolutionary War, most people did not think of themselves as Americans. They thought of themselves as New Yorkers, as Virginians, as Georgians, as Carolinians. I know that, in my case, the Randalls, I'll talk about them a little bit more. My ancestors left England in the 17th century and settled in Stonington, Connecticut. And, every Randall born from 1690 until 1800, they were all born in Stonington, Connecticut. So the Randalls and Captain John Randall fought in the Revolutionary War. He was fighting for Connecticut, not for the United States. Or old John Barnheiser, my favorite of my dead relatives, fought in the Revolution for Pennsylvania, where his family had lived for a long time. In fact, that crisis of identity, which I'm going to talk about later on down in your notes, was the first and major split in America. There was not a uniform notion of nation until the Civil War. In fact, as late as 1861, when the Civil War broke out, you had people in the North who saw themselves as Americans who, right, happened to come from a state like Ohio or Pennsylvania, and Southerners thought of themselves as state terms. So in the United States, we created a state and a government and the unified notion of being an American. Because certainly, if you look at us, right, certainly we don't look alike. We're very multi ethnic. We speak multiple languages. We come from all over the world. What unifies us is law and political philosophy and certain values. The notion of freedom and liberty and various other things are what bind us together, even though culturally we may identify ourselves very, very differently. Australia would be another great example. The next type of nation state are what I call part nation states. And this is where a nation is divided between two, and it may be even more states. Examples would include Korea, right, which even today is divided between a North Korea and a South Korea. Germany during the Cold War was divided into an East and a West Germany. Vietnam, for a quarter of a century, was divided between a North and a South Vietnam until the end of the Vietnamese War, when the Vietnamese people were unified. And then there are multinational states, states containing two or more substantially complete nations within its boundaries. Certainly, Canada would be an example where the French Quebecers, their ancestors in many cases go back uh, almost 2 centuries before the creation of modern Canada, which occurred shortly after the U.S. Civil War. Certainly, the United Kingdom, our first country, right, where we're going to talk about England, but you also have the Welsh in this area known as Wales, the Scots in this land that we call Scotland, and of course, the Irish in Northern Ireland. My favorite example of a multinational state, in fact, I believe it was the last major multinational empire in the world, the former Soviet Union, where 15 of the 17 largest ethnic groups had their own republic, which was kind of the equivalent of an American state, but it was comprised largely of 15 nations. And the name of the republic told you the nation. So, for example, in the Baltic Republic, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they were Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians. Or if you look to the western part, the Ukraine, with Ukrainians. Or perhaps in the southern tier, Uzbekistan with Uzbeks, Kazakhs in Kazakhstan, Tajiks in Tajikistan, Turkmen in Turkmenistan, and you can go on and on in that particular case. So that was a state that was specifically built around this notion of nationhood. So even though we talk about nation states, they take slightly different dynamics. I'm now going to flip the script a little bit because I've talked about nations a bit, I've talked about states a bit, and I've talked about nation states. And I'm stealing from Gregory Mahler, who in his book I found his theory captivating. I think it's persuasive. And essentially, Professor Mahler was interested in this notion of political development and modernization. One of my old friends from graduate school, she teaches on the East Coast, and this is kind of the center of her research, although her research interest is more in the notion of economic development and modernization and how political systems can facilitate or impede it. But Mahler made the point that countries evolve just as individuals evolve, right? We were all babies at one time. We became toddlers. We then became children and teenagers and young adults and middle-aged and seniors, and we go through this evolutionary development, and that development is inevitable. And Mahler said that just as individuals go through individual psychological and physical development, so too do states. And Mahler claimed that there were 5 crises that nations encounter in building a stable nation, with the 5th one being a crisis that is never resolved. And I'll tell you kind of why that 5th one may be different than the other 4, although I'm not sure I will get to it in this mini lecture because I'm looking down and I see I have 5.5 minutes left. The first one to me is the most interesting personally. So I'm going to give you my bias. The crisis of identity. Of course, your identity is how you describe yourself. So in the crisis of identity, what we're interested in is how do individuals under a political regime describe themselves? So do people describe themselves in similar terms or in different terms? And of course, I alluded to this earlier in the mini lecture, but I'll be more explicit here. I believe this crisis was the major crisis the United States faced from the late 18th century when the country was formed until the U.S. Civil War. So there were people. My favorite founding father is Benjamin Franklin, and he referred to himself very early on as an American, and there were a few kind of enlightened elites that did this. But the vast majority of people who lived in our country considered themselves Virginians, New Yorkers, Georgians, Carolinians, Vermonters, or whatever it happened to be. And the U.S. Civil War, to me, is the greatest crisis that the United States has ever faced. And in this particular case, the Civil War, in my mind, when I think of the U.S. Civil War, I think of an onion. If you cut through an onion, there are multiple layers to it. And I think that this is true of the Civil War. A lot of people try to say that it's one factor. And I think they all simplify and distort. There is no question that slavery was an issue. But people who say it was only slavery, in my mind, are misguided. Or some of my Southern friends who say that it was only about states' rights and the 10th Amendment. Yeah, it was a factor. But once again, not the only factor. To me, underlying all of this, and the one that I do not believe is discussed enough, is that the U.S. Civil War was a crisis of identity. It was a war of identity. In this particular case, Northerners defined themselves in national terms as Americans, and Southerners defined themselves in regional terms as Virginians first, as Texans first, as Georgians, Carolinians first. And the U.S. Civil War, the deadliest war anywhere in the world, think about that. The U.S. Civil War was the deadliest war anywhere on this planet from the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 until World War I, about 100 years later, when it started in 1914. Now, there are other great examples of the crisis of identity. Certainly, the former Yugoslavia would be an example. Yugoslavia tried to be federal. I'll talk about federalism later. Federalism does help with diversity, but the divisions in Yugoslavia were so deep that Yugoslavia disintegrated and became a group of countries, including Serbia and Croatia, and, Montenegro, and others. Certainly, you can think about the crisis of identity that exists in Canada to this day, with the French Quebecers sticking out. And in fact, at one time when I was a young man, there were a lot of people who believed that Quebec was going to leave Canada because it is a very different province than the rest of them in Canada. And federalism helped. The French Quebecers were given a lot of guarantees to protect their language and culture, etc. And Canada has survived. You can think about the Eritreans in Somalia, or the Chechens in Russia, or the Tamils in Sri Lanka, and a variety of others where you have people who simply do not identify themselves the way that other people in that country do. A group that's been in the news a lot in multiple countries, including Iraq and Syria and other, are the Kurds, right? The Kurds are a nation without a fully defined state. Instead, they're dispersed amongst many states. And so there is this crisis of identity that exists in those countries because you have this rather large group that kind of sticks out and defines themselves differently. In my mind, a country must solve to a substantial extent this crisis of identity in order to be politically stable. It doesn't mean that there aren't groups that stick out. It doesn't mean that you cannot coexist with other groups, but there needs to be at least some sense of shared identity.